do visit that website and do look at these referrals and resources in this and similar programs that we are offering, because we're behind you. We think that's great stuff too. But this hour, we're going to be hearing about getting rid of the slumlords and getting decent housing and getting some state laws in place and maybe some legal challenges in place to pursue that. I'd like to introduce you to Amy Pritchard, who's on the faculty of the law school, who has been fighting the good fight this session because there have been bills coming through that are undesirable. And she's going to tell us where things stand at this moment. Amy?
Thank you all for being here. My name is Amy Pritchard, and I teach at the law school. I run the Consumer Protection Clinic, which is where students learn to become lawyers. We do a lot of landlord-tenant cases, and I also work part-time. I've been a legal aid attorney representing tenants for almost the past decade. So I'm going to talk to you, everything I say today is my personal opinion, doesn't reflect my employer's, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the current state of landlord-tenant laws in Arkansas, some of the litigation we have that's ongoing to try to improve these laws, and some of the legislation that is passing through the The system? The system. Not enough coffee yet. Some of the legislation that's pending or that has just passed. And just to start, I want to say a couple of basic assumptions that I have going into this. I am a tenants advocate, so I represent tenants both in informal advocacy, talking to landlords, and also in court. So when I'm looking at things, I'm trying to prove situations for tenants, but I also know that there are a lot of bad tenants out there. There are a lot of bad landlords, and there are a lot of bad tenants. So every time we sit down to have a conversation, we've got to acknowledge that there are bad tenants, and we need laws to protect landlords from being taken advantage of by those bad tenants. We've also got to acknowledge that there are bad landlords out there, and we've got to make sure that there are laws that protect tenants and give them due process when a landlord is taking advantage of them. So some of the slumlords that Annie was talking about, we need to make sure that tenants and our communities are protected from them. A bad rental property or a bad apartment building not only impacts the individuals who live there, the tenants who face housing instability, homelessness, may have to move, may have health implications because of that bad property, but it also impacts the community around it. And some of that is the stuff you were talking about this last hour. If you have a nuisance property that's either attracting crime, or is creating health implications for the greater community, that's also decreasing the community's property values, and that's decreasing the overall health and safety of that community. If you have a landlord that's either, we have a lot of landlords that are out of state that don't know what's going on with their property, aren't being accountable. They have property managers who aren't monitoring the property to see what's going on there, and that's impacting the overall health and safety of our communities and the value of all the property around it. And the other thing that I just want to put out there before we talk about the state of laws in Arkansas is that when a tenant rents a property under basic property law, they get an interest in that property. So they get a legal interest. They don't own it the same as an owner, but they get a legal interest and get certain protections under the law if that interest is going to be taken away from them. So even if a tenant doesn't pay their rent or is doing things that should make them lose that property, there are legal steps that a landlord has to go through in order to do that. So I'm sure most of you have heard Arkansas is called the worst place to be a tenant or to rent in the country. And that's actually true. It's not just, it makes the nightly news and it sounds good, but it's actually true. Arkansas has some of the worst landlord-tenant laws in the country. And when I first started practicing, I thought that it was just we hadn't progressed, that we hadn't gone from 1900s laws to a modern landlord-tenant relationship. But the reality is, over the past 20 years, the laws have changed significantly in the favor of landlords. We weren't in a great state before that. Most of what we had was laws that were created in the courts. Arkansas, for the past century, has been the only state that criminalizes non-payment of rent. So if a tenant misses their rent payment by 1 day, they lose all rights to be in the property. And if they don't move out after receiving a written notice from the landlord, they can face criminal prosecution. We're the only state that does that, and I'll talk a bit about that as we go through this time. And that's been on the books for a century now, and we've been the only state to do this for nearly that time. But in 2001, we added a provision that a tenant could face up to 90 days in jail if they were found guilty of non-payment of rent, and a requirement that in order to fight that and say that's not true, they had to pay everything that the landlord alleged they owed before they even got a hearing. So we have, there's a case that took place in Little Rock where the landlord alleged that the tenant had not paid rent for years, so $20,000 worth of past due rent. Under the way that the law is currently written, that tenant would need to pay all that money into the registry of the court prior to getting a hearing, or would face up to 90 days in jail. And in that exact scenario is one of the legal challenges that was brought in 2015, and she did not pay that money into the registry. She was found guilty and she was sentenced to a jail term. So yeah, in 2001, that law was made more,
Humane?
more what?
Humane?
Less humane, more, yeah, with it gave more teeth to now when a police officer comes out to serve this eviction notice, they tell a tenant, you can face jail time if you don't move out. So a lot of tenants, even if they have a defense or they did pay, may have already had bad experiences with the criminal justice system, may not be able to take the time off to go and appear at a criminal arraignment and then fight a criminal case, or they may just be scared and they're going to move out rather than try to assert whatever defenses they may have. In 2005, the legislature passed a law that makes landlords immune from any tort liability, so any personal injury, death, or property damage that occurs on their property.
Would you give the name of the laws that you refer to? Would you give the name of
I don't know if I can give you that site, but I can give it to you afterwards. I can give you some of the new
We will
ones.
post it on our
Yeah.
Facebook page.
Okay.
She'll send me all the citations.
Sure. So yeah, in 2005, it's now the landlords cannot be sued under torts, so under negligence, if there's something in the property that causes the tenants to have property damage or to be injured on the property or to die on the property. The only exception to that is if the landlord agrees to make repairs in writing or begins making repairs and does it in a faulty manner. So what that does is it's an incentive for the landlord not to even try. Yeah, because as long as the landlord doesn't touch the property and doesn't say they're going to make repairs, they can't be liable for anything that happens on the property.
That includes gas leaks, gas explosions, everything.
Yes. And then in 2007, I can tell you the name of this one, the Arkansas Residential Landlord Tenant Act was passed, which was based on the Model Uniform Residential Landlord Tenant Act, which is experts looked at all state laws and came up what would be the best laws for landlords and tenants, the most comprehensive. And what Arkansas did was they put in place all of the tenants' responsibilities, all of the landlord's rights, and they just gutted the other half. So any of the tenants' rights were cut out, and any of the landlord's responsibilities were cut out. So we have a completely one-sided law. That was 2007. And then the other thing that happened in 2007 was that in the eviction proceedings law, they added a requirement that if a tenant wants to challenge a civil eviction, they also have to pay into the registry whatever the landlord says is owed prior to getting a hearing. So both criminally and civilly, if a tenant even wants to present a defense, the laws require them to pay what the landlord alleges is due even before a hearing to see if the landlord's telling the truth. So that's kind of, it's been the last 20 years that everything's been enacted in code. And there have not been any pro-tenant laws passed during that period. They've all been very much in the favor of the landlords. There were 2 attempts in 2013 and 2015 to pass a basic implied warranty of habitability. Arkansas is the only state that does not have a law that requires the landlord to meet any sort of minimum standards in terms of housing conditions. Every other state has some sort of minimum standards that a tenant can expect to have if they are renting a residential property. Little Rock does have minimum standards for rental properties. A couple other cities have rental codes or housing codes, but most of Arkansas, there's no minimum standards. And there's no law that would make a landlord have to make any sort of repairs on the property, unless it's something in the lease or in otherwise in writing that the landlords agreed to make those repairs. There are some basic, the fire code, the plumbing code. There are some basic codes at the state level that a lot of the cities have enacted. But outside of that, a lot of tenants are surprised if there's a hole in their roof or their door's gone or, some sort of gas problem. There's nothing that can be done that the tenant can do to compel their landlord to make those repairs. Okay.
We all want, we don't want slum landlords. We don't want properties that are not safe. But we're talking also about crime and these issues. And the problem is that, if a landlord is made to make improvements to their rental property, in reality, what ends up happening, you have people living in substandard rental properties because they're impoverished and it's what they can afford. And then if the landlords are made to make improvements and they spend their money to make these improvements, then they go up on their rent. So it goes back to, it makes it harder for people who have come out of the prison system, have a criminal background, getting into a place to live, and it makes it difficult for people who may not have the means to pay a higher rent. So it's kind of a catch-22. And I'm not sure what the answer is, but I just wanted to, kind of bring that perspective in because, I deal with, all the resource specialists deal with when, apartments and rental properties are shut down because of life safety issues that are found. And we come in and have to help residents find another place to move to. And then it becomes a problem because many of these people might not have IDs, they might have a criminal background, and it makes it difficult to find another place for them to go.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely a concern. Every other state does have some minimum standard, and Arkansas is no longer the cheapest rent, so there are other states that have this minimum standard where the rent is just as affordable as in Arkansas. But also what I've found in representing some of these tenants is that landlords, the rent's not always cheap. So in the situation in Alexander Apartments, which we'll talk about, the rent was anywhere from $675 to $825. And the tenants were living in sewage and mold because for those very reasons. They had criminal records, they had bad credit, they couldn't get rentals anywhere else. And the landlord was charging market level rents. So it's not always, I think it would be a lot easier for me if, they were paying $250 a month or $300 or whatever they could pay. But a lot of times, it's these market level rents and the landlords are taking advantage of the people that you're talking about.
If I may just interject and then we'll get some questions. So if we can have this minimum floor below which you legally cannot go, and if you do, the authorities will catch you and force you to fix it up to minimum standards across the board, then they're basically going to have to simply get along with less than these outrageous profits, because everybody's in the same boat, and there isn't a question of shifting you off to some cheaper property, because all the property's got to be fixing it to this level.
Right, and in
Is that
theory-
where we're headed?
Yes, and in theory, that
Okay.
does exist in Little Rock. There's an ordinance that says if you're gonna rent property, it has to be at minimum standards. It has to be inspected. There's not enough, and I know this group's talked about it a lot, there's not enough code enforcement officers to do all of those inspections on a regular basis. And tenants have no right to privately enforce that. So a tenant, their only option under the law currently is to move. And there are some cases where a tenant can ask for damages if the conditions have made it such that they're moving and having to incur certain expenses. But even if a tenant just had a right to enforce the existing standards in Little Rock, that seems like it would give code enforcement a little assistance, because they're out there on their own just trying to enforce these things. And if a tenant calls code, the landlord can evict them. So there's no protection for a tenant to try to make their situation better. And I know there's a couple of questions. I'll take a couple questions and then talk about the litigation and legislation we have going on. Robert? Sorry, Denise.
The city's inspectors find these apartment complexes that are so substandard, they have to tell the landlord that he can't rent out anymore, and then they have to move the tenants. It's a big job because the city sends in people to help relocate these people. So it's a huge burden on the city. And I think you're explaining that if there was a state law saying the landlord must have habitable rental property, it would be really take a burden off the city, because there's limits to what the city will allow. And
Right.
if there's a state law saying you can't go below this standard, then it would be a lot easier for our city, would it not?
It would, and then tenants would have some recourse against the landlords rather than having to rely on the city for some sort of assistance, either hotel or relocation assistance. Denise?
Yes, if you had to pick a city to kind of emulate what they're doing with their tenant landlord situation, is there an ideal city that you know of that might potentially work here?
Well, I really do think Little Rock, what we have on the books is pretty progressive. We have a law that says a landlord has to get a certificate before renting, and is it 2 years?
2 years on the books.
They have to have it inspected again. If that was happening, that would be good. If tenants had a way to go to environmental court and bring claims on their own, that would be good. I think we have a lot of the right ideas here in Little Rock. It's just giving tenants the power to enforce those. Do you have a question back there? Go ahead.
I have a question. I think mine mostly deals with the landlord. Now, if you or Kathy or whoever can assist us with this question. I live in a fairly old neighborhood. Most of us have been there 50 years or more. And it's a real nice neighborhood. Well, one of our neighbors died a year ago. They've had, I think, 3 tenants in there since then. First tenant, the man who lived there, he was a contractor. He took his front porch and turned it into an office. Well, the people who lived there previously, I understand what they said. They wanted $800 a month for the property, for the rental for the house. And I guess they couldn't afford it, so they were renting out the little office. And there are no bathroom facilities or anything in there, but they were problem neighbors. Now the people that are living in there, they've been there for a few months. They are deteriorating our neighborhood. I mean, they leave trash out on the curb all week. They have, the little things, green tops on, the white top, the yellow tops on, we put yard waste, recycling. They put stuff in there that's not, the city's not going to pick up because it's not recyclable stuff. And that stuff blows all over the neighborhood. It stayed out there for about 3 weeks until I called the city back. blowed all over the neighborhood, across the alley, across the street, to the neighbors over across the street. And everybody complains about it. Nobody knows what to do about it. Right now, they've got a lot of junk, old furniture and just a lot of stuff sitting on the front porch, and it's a nice neighborhood. They're tearing down our neighborhood. They've got junk cars on the curb and in the driveway, in the back.
All of which are violations of city code.
I know, I called code enforcement last week, but the thing is, they've been bad neighbors. I understand there are about 7 or 8 of them living in that house. And I called the Secretary of State's office to find out who owns the property. And they told me some Chinese non-profit organization owns the property. They gave me the name of the organization. I couldn't find them in phone record. I couldn't find them on the internet or anywhere. And the address that they signed up under, the address that they gave the Secretary of State's office when they filed, I couldn't even find that address. Who do we go to get these people out of our neighborhood?
I would say Consumer Protection Office of the Attorney General's office, because they have the ability to deal with out-of-state fraud, and you found an apparent questionable operation in the Arkansas, based outside of Arkansas. And I would start there. Then if you go to the website for the Attorney General's office, there's going to be a Consumer Protection
I have his
Division.
number.
And I would see where they can take you. As well as you've already done, go to codes. And keep on calling, obviously. One of the things we were recently reassured about is if you use the 311 application on your smartphone, which is useful because day or night you can turn in a report, but more to the point of following up in a long-term problem, when you do that, you get an instant confirmation that your complaint has been taken into the system. You get that magic complaint code number. You're told that it's going to be taken care of within 5 business days, and it has a readout on the phone. Your request is pending. And then it's got a change of status that it has been addressed. And if you see that there's still problems at that address, you now have a particular record that you can take to other officials, like Victor Turner, the Housing and Neighborhoods Director that we've just made full-time, who's over those code inspectors.
These people had 7 dogs on the property, which is against the law. And we reported the dogs. And one day, all the dogs were running loose all over the neighborhood. So we called the city, and they did send somebody out to get the dogs. And then the lady who came out from the animal shelter, we went up there, we saw she was coming to put the dogs back over the fence instead of taking the dogs to the animal shelter. Well, I called Bruce's office and reported it. They came out there the next day and picked up all the dogs except the oldest dog. And then they locked her on the back porch. And the next day, that night, we saw all these big dogs hanging around. I think the dog was in heat. And all these dogs from all over the neighborhood was trying to get in that back door.
But you're right, you got to just keep on calling, Judy,
Those people
and
couldn't
call
come
and
out
call
the
and
door
call.
and been attacked by those dogs because they, she had a dog in the house they eat.
Kathleen, did you want to add anything before I start?
was just going to say, it's good to turn in the premise issues, things like that, to code officers, police, whatever. But if there is a particular home property that is a real nuisance, be sure and let your resource specialist know too, because we tend to know the people in the neighborhoods because that's who we work directly with. And we work with police and code enforcement and the other entities within the city of Little Rock. And we can help more by pulling people together to address the different issues that are going on, rather than it being.
Who is our resource officer?
Where do you live?
I live in South Little Rock, well, in Central Little Rock.
She'd be served by 33rd Street.
Yeah.
Okay, 33rd Street, but if you contact any resource
Used to be called alert
specialist.
centers. The new name is not alert center.
It's Resource Center, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Any of the resource centers can get you to who is in your area.
All right, thank you.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about ongoing litigation and legislation, and then I'll get to your question. Two of the big cases that are going on right now, one of them is here in Central Arkansas, is the Alexandra Apartments case. Right before Christmas in 2015, city code and fire officials did an inspection of Alexandra Apartments and found pages and pages and pages of violations. And I've had clients at Alexandra Apartments since 2014, and this was an ongoing, code was going down there regularly trying to make improvements. There were ongoing environmental court cases, and conditions weren't improving to the level that they would need to be in order to have a habitable apartment building. So after a fire inspection in December of 2015, the fire chief gave an order to shut down that building. My legal clinic, Legal Aid of Arkansas, and the Center for Arkansas Legal Services represented a number of tenants and Arkansas Community Organization. In that situation, we brought a suit against the city of Little Rock for not providing the tenants with an opportunity to be heard before the complex was shut down. But we also brought suit against the apartment complex owner because of the conditions that were going on there. We had a big hearing right after Christmas that year, and we have a hearing this week to discuss whether this apartment owner was required to hold the property to any sort of minimum standards. So some of the tenants, like my tenant was living in an apartment where every time she flushed the toilet, sewage would back up into the bathtub, into the shower, and there were other places where the backyard, there was sewage coming up, there was mold that had been painted over in certain units. A lot of the tenants were experiencing situations where they would call code would come out and cite the complex, so its code was doing everything that it could, but that process is slow. The only thing that it can lead to is the complex being closed down if the owner doesn't make those repairs. The other litigation...
So where is the standing today on Alexander?
We have a hearing on Tuesday. We're asking the judge to say whether whether the tenants can bring any claims for this minimum standard.
That's a health matter, can do.
I'm sorry, what?
That's a health problem as well, if there's mold and feces and everything, so he's
Absolutely.
obviously guilty. He's not keeping it up to standard. So why do you need all this experience?
Yeah, I mean, so the tenants, yeah, like I'm saying, the tenants have there's no written law under which the tenants can go and do something about this, and
But he's obviously guilty, he's not keeping it up to go.
yeah, and he did plead guilty to several claims in environmental court. So, and yeah, like I said earlier, those apartments were renting from anywhere from $675 to $825 a month. So they
Where
weren't
are they?
down off of Colonel Glenn. Yeah,
Over there by Kroger.
right. There's the Big Country Chateau, which has been in the news a lot for conditions, and then right next to this used to be called Bradford Place or some other chateau, and now it's Alexandra Apartments.
You basically University and Colonel Glenn
Yeah.
is the big intersection right there.
Well, I was just going to ask the question. I know they said they have a law in place to where they send them out. They supposed to check these cars like every 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
But who makes sure that they do that? I'm just saying how.
Well, the Coalition of Neighborhoods that got the law passed in '94 keeps saying, what's your annual report and how many have you hired and how many inspections have they pulled off? And it's way behind. And they've never come back around to apartment 1 at the start of year 3. They've never gotten enough people going enough times. They now do have full employment of about 35 inspectors. But of course, they have high turnover and they've got to train the newcomers. So they are always chasing a goal they will never attain because people open up new rentals and turn this duplex into a rental because mama died. And they won't know about those until somebody gets them the official notice about that. So it is hard to do it, and you just have to keep reporting and reporting. And if you come to our monthly meetings, we regularly report on the rental inspection program of the city of Little Rock. And we ask for more and better.
And the other litigation that's going on right now is regarding this, what's called the criminal eviction statute, which is the law that says a tenant can be criminally charged. It doesn't actually allow a court to evict a tenant. There's no, a criminal court cannot throw a tenant out, but basically what it does is right now allows the court to order a tenant to jail even, or find them guilty of a misdemeanor if they don't pay their rent and don't move out. So it's kind of using police power to push a tenant out, but there is no actual authority. The criminal court doesn't have the authority to evict a tenant. That law was challenged first here in Pulaski County at the beginning of 2015, I believe, and it was found unconstitutional. And then the first and second judicial districts, so in Northeast Arkansas, found it to be unconstitutional. We brought a federal lawsuit in Baxter County, and in our complaint, we alleged that the rent was actually paid and the landlord returned the rent and then gave this 10-day notice to vacate. So we're asking a federal judge to determine whether the law is constitutional. In the meantime, last week, the legislature passed Senate Bill 25, which is a rollback of the law to the pre-2001 time. And what it is an attempt to restart the criminal prosecutions here in Pulaski County. So using criminal court and the sheriff to go out and serve tenants, criminal court to handle these evictions, and to restart the prosecutions in Northeast Arkansas where they've been stopped. So it went through the Senate, the House, and it's now waiting for the governor's signature. So that's a bill that, if enacted, would return Little Rock to, if the prosecutors did decide to start these prosecutions again, it would start a lot of these prosecutions. Judge Lytle used to have a lot of these. Every day she'd have criminal arraignments on evictions and then trials on these evictions. A lot of them were coming out of the Southwest Baseline area. A lot of the actual charges and criminal cases, that's where they were coming from. The other pending legislation that I want everyone to be aware of, did you have a question?
Are you optimistic the federal judge in Harrison will in fact strike down the law?
I am not sure now, because we strongly believe that the law is unconstitutional. 3 judges have already found it to be unconstitutional. Procedurally, I'm not sure what the judge will do right now, because he stayed the federal case to wait to see what the legislature did. And now it's a different law. So this isn't, our client's not going to be prosecuted under this new law. And so we don't know if the judge is going to address the issue in this case, or we'd have to bring another case to have a judge look at what's going to be the new law, which is, there were 3 parts to the current law, and this new law just takes the 3rd part off, that potential jail time and that registry requirement.
Is this a lobbying issue that is it because the landlords have more lobbying ability?
They have a lock on the legislature,
Yeah,
flat lock on the ledge.
There's no tenants union or lobby. It's actually the Realtors Association, so the representatives of the property managers who've lobbied to push all this through, and they have definitely a lot more power than tenants. The Landlords Association did try to work with tenants in the past 2 legislative sessions to come up with a warranty of habitability, a basic minimum standard. And the Landlords Association is working with tenants advocates now to try to come up with a civil eviction that's fast and easy. So landlords, because that's what landlords want. They want a way, if their tenant's not paying, to get them out. And having a sheriff come and knock on the door and say, show up to criminal court works. But it's not fair for those tenants who actually may be entitled to some sort of defense or may be entitled to stay in the property.
Can we do a fast civil?
We're working on trying to develop one and get it, hopefully we'll be able to get something filed this year that would allow a landlord to file it, the tenant served, there'd be a quick hearing, and then it get decided in a way that the landlord's not waiting for months to get a resolution if their tenant's not paying rent, but at the same time, the tenants get an opportunity for a judge to hear their side. And I'll say briefly, and then I'll open up to questions. The other thing that's pending right now is 1166. It's a House bill. It is a realtor's bill from the Realtors Association. It is called an implied quality standards, and it limits the remedies a tenant would have in it only requires the landlord to have make repairs in 3 situations, and then it limits a tenant's remedies to moving out. So it requires a building envelope, which is probably the roof and the walls, plumbing, electricity that was the same as if it when it was built, if it was compliant with code at the time that the building was built, and heat and air if there were heat and air at the time that the tenant moved in. And if one of those things goes wrong, the tenant's only recourse would then be to move out. So there's probably a little more protection available for tenants now than this law would afford. So there is hope that we'll also file something that would offer some minimum standard this year.
And with that, we've come to the official time element. Once again, we're on break, but we will not stop questions if everybody's willing to keep going.
And did you have a question?
I have an observation. When we got really hot on the path of the slum landlords, that's when the landlords got an organization. And their organization is for their benefit. And because you have small landlords that is on maybe 2 houses that were air property, then you have the large ones. And the membership and their numbers creates a very powerful lobbying group. There is no tenants organization that's truly an organization. And so they have to depend on neighborhood associations, American Civil Liberties, the civil rights organizations when somebody is truly. But I don't think most of us realize the homeless population grew when people started throwing out tenants who could not afford the high rent they were charging with such substandard health and safety issues. So we need a lot of community education as to who the tenants are renting from, what the prices are. So we don't have any of that. Do you see how the tenants, without them, because they're all different categories, but the most important thing is with the population of tenants, you have senior citizens, you have women, and you have families that don't have anybody but themselves to fight for themselves. So how do you see public education on the status of rental rights? We know about civil rights, we know about women's rights, we know about agent rights, but tenant rights, how do you see that we need an institutional group?
Yeah, I do think that's true.
How would you get it started?
And I think social media is helping some with that, but that's a really important point, and I think it's something that would be very beneficial to have some sort of tenants group, some sort of organization. And I'm not sure who should form that or how, but I do think it's badly needed.
And there's not such a thing today.
There's not one. We don't have one, but in some big cities, they do have, and tenants. That's how they got some protection.
Right.
But all we have now is landlords.
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful.
There's some powerful folks, because the big landlords protect themselves, and the little landlords get the benefit of their lobbying strength.
Two-part question.
Sure.
Okay, so one, I've read the book Evicted, and I don't know if you have, but it's an excellent book that kind of touches on a lot of these issues. And one of the issues in the book is related to the housing authorities in any local jurisdiction and how they can influence where the money goes and to which landlords. And it's part of the reasons that the rent in a property such as you're describing is so high, at least in this book, in this example, which is set in the north. I think it's St. Paul.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is, do we have, like, for example, in Little Rock, is the Little Rock Housing Authority, is there any chance that there can be some regulation there with what the housing authority will pay that influences in a positive way renters' rights through just, we're gonna make some code or regulation about what we'll pay for? So that's the first question. And the second is to quickly recap what you're doing here today. What's the best way that you think the people in this room who don't know as much about the issues, obviously, as you do, can help? I mean, is it writing a check to Legal Aid of Arkansas, or what can we do?
Sure. So I think that one interesting thing about the housing authority and Section 8 or federally funded housing is that there is a minimum standard. So if the government is paying your rent, you have the right to live in a unit that there's a checklist, and there's supposed to be an inspector that goes out and inspects that property. So the more that housing authorities do to go out and check, a lot of these properties that are being closed down, there's a significant number of tenants living there that are receiving some sort of government assistance. And I think they are taking some leadership in both doing some of those inspections, but also identifying the landlords because a lot of times you'll have a lot of different LLCs, but they may be owned by the same landlord with the same business practices, and identifying those and stopping the money from going to them. There's a website, fairpropertylaws.org, and I'll send that to Kathy as well. That's got a lot of information about Arkansas law. It's got action alerts. There is a Facebook page that I'll also send to Kathy. I think it's Arkansans for Fair Property Law, but it's, so you can follow those. The fairpropertylaws.org has a lot of this background, and information is being added on a regular basis.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I wish there's a way that we could connect the dots, and like a lot of the properties that are rental that's in the community, that it's a way that I guess the city could let the association know, so we could better work with those residents to come up with solutions, because it's power in numbers, we know. And so in that way, they have a support system. Because I know over in my area, one of the houses on the street behind me, I often see people moving out and other people moving in. And so I asked one of the neighbors beside him, I said, what's wrong with the property? And they said, it's a plumbing issue. And so, and you see a sign up there, because the realtors still, instead of fixing the problem, they'll just go patch it up and put the sign back out.
Right.
And once new tenants come in, they be like, okay, then they realize the problem. So that's bad business. And you know, we want stability, because if we're having families that moving in, you know, they have to uproot again, and they have children. And you know, and we want stability in our communities. And so we want to keep them there.
Yeah, and that data is, now there's more and more data, and it's pretty readily available that you can talk to probably the resource officers. But I know that the University District Development Corporation was looking at that data for those neighborhood associations, and looking at code enforcement data and then police data, and trying to connect those dots. Are there certain properties that the neighborhood association needs to make some sort of strategy, whether it's reaching out to the landlord or coming up with some other strategy to try to really address the biggest problems in the neighborhood.
And keep in mind, the code inspection reports, that city code inspector we're talking about, when they come out to a property and they go through this multiple pages of what's the plumbing and the wiring and the roofs and the porches and the rails and window screens and everything else, defective or not, that's a public record. So if you want to target Slumlord Larry's Rat Palace at 500 Markham Street, then you can go to the code inspector folks and you'll say, I would like, by provision of the Freedom of Information Law of Arkansas, a copy of the file on 500 Markham, Slumlord Larry's Roach Palace. And they'll lay it out for you. They have always been very cooperative whenever I've come around asking to see their files. because they are delighted when citizens are interested in these substandard conditions. They're thrilled if somebody's gonna copy that file and go put it out on the social media site. Where your neighborhood association has got a Facebook page, you can just run, inspection reports of the last 30 days. It just depends on how much time you're willing to give it. But you can do it, and that's public record. Slumlord Dairy cannot go after you and say, don't you be talking about me. You're just reporting the government factual record.
But don't they have to be invited into their home, you know?
Oh, no, the state law, the law of the city says they gotta let them in to Larry's Roach Palace at 500 Market. They don't get to say no. So, we're moving on to our next speaker here. Okay, quick.
Okay, what role, if any, does the Arkansas Fair Housing Commission play in this?
So they investigate complaints of fair housing violations. So sometimes if there are health impacts, an individual's disability is implicated, or some of the criminal record issues that are keeping people from renting, that are leading them to the substandard housing, they're involved in those issues, but they're mostly focused on discrimination based on race, gender, the 5 protected classes, disability.
I have a question on, do you all have a squatters law here? Squatters law,
No.
meaning if somebody comes and
Oh,
lives-
squatters law?
Yeah, lives in your vacant house. Can the landlord just get them out, or is it still law that they can stay in there or whatever?
Yeah, Jennifer, do you remember I think in Arkansas it's like 7 years that somebody has to be living there before they get any sort of legal right. But yeah, a tenant gets certain rights transferred to them by nature of the lease. But if you invite somebody into your house, or if somebody just shows up in your house and then you tell them to leave, then they're a trespasser. So it's a
If
different.
somebody moves into a vacant house,
They're trespassing.
yeah, so you can't get them out.
They're trespassers.
Yeah, I know that, but in a lot of states, they have rights and it takes forever to get them out.
Not in Arkansas.
No.
In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you could shoot them. If you come into my occupied house, I can shoot you. Arkansas is tough on that.
Shoot 2